Well, hello there, truth seekers. We've now reached a point in this series I've been very excited to get to, because Georg Hegel is probably the philosopher that para-philosophy has most in common with, at least Western philosopher. Previously, we discussed the critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and how it brings us to the same edge of reason reached by the Buddhist Madhyamaka philosophy of Nagarjuna. And now we're going to discuss how to go beyond that, and how duality can overcome itself in the recognition of the world as self-knowledge. If you enjoy these videos and find them useful, please consider supporting me and enabling me to make more. You can find out how to do so in the description below. Thank you for considering this video, and I hope you enjoy it. So, let us first be reminded that before Hegel, Immanuel Kant introduced the idea of the transcendental structure of subjectivity, which refers to the universal, necessary framework through which experience is organized via the categories of understanding. This is not a dynamic, universal spirit like we find in Hegel, nor is it the empirical subject which we experience. It is the fixed and general form of subjectivity, whose purpose is to highlight how our experience of the world is grounded in what is basically a subjective framework, and not objective fact, like early science would have us believe. The transcendental subject thus has the role of structuring our experience of phenomena, as it defines how noumena can appear as phenomena. And in this sense, it plays a similar role in Kant's system as the dialectical matrix in para-philosophy, which, as we saw in the previous video, can be interpreted as the structure of relative experience. Now, where Hegel breaks from Kant is in claiming that the way in which we experience the world, through the categories of the understanding, is not just the necessary form of subjectivity, but can also be considered objective. Indeed, history and the development of human consciousness are just the self-unfolding of an underlying rational drive, which is the absolute. There is a significant connection between Hegel and para-philosophy here then, and it is surmised in Hegel's dictum that the rational is real and the real is rational. There is a mutual complementary relationship between how we can experience subjectively and what we ultimately experience objectively, without either one preceding the other. For Hegel, the rational structure of reality is revealed through our engagement with it. Similarly, the dialectical matrix is not merely subjective, but is also an expression of the rational structure of reality. So, there is a universal structure which we call the dialectical matrix. While Kant claims that this structure is the structure of subjectivity, and the structure of subjectivity in turn moulds perception in its likeness, para-philosophy, so as Hegel, claim that this structure is not reducible to subjectivity, but is equally objective. The correspondence between subjective reason and objective reality is then the basis for how we gain reliable knowledge of the world. Accordingly, both Hegel and para-philosophy remove the need to hypothesize the existence of a transcendent noumenal realm that we could never know. And we should note here that while Kant accepts that we have no way of knowing whether such a transcendent world exists, it is implied by the fact that our world, in Kant's framework, is ultimately subjective, so that it is reasonable to assume that there must be an objective world that grounds it. The consequence of the claim that reason and reality are two expressions of the same underlying process is that since reason is dialectical, constituted by opposites, reality must also be dialectical, with opposing perspectives being complementary and equally true within their respective contexts. So, what Hegel has done is remove the skeptical element of Kant's system by reconciling subjectivity and objectivity. Rather than postulating a transcendental objectivity that grounds empirical subjectivity, Hegel claims that the empirical world grounds itself through dialectical self-construction. And this is something that could also be accepted by the Mahayana Buddhist, who teaches that there is no independent ultimate reality. There is only conventional reality, which is grounded in its own interdependence with itself. Both Hegel and the Madhyamaka would agree, therefore, that when we say the real world, we are using a relative notion of reality, and one that is interdependent and ultimately non-dual with the absolute. It is merely that this is the only valid notion of reality, because the relative is non-dual with the absolute in a dialectical process, just as dependent origination is non-dual with emptiness in Madhyamaka. The major difference between Hegel and Madhyamaka is that Hegel also asserts that the ultimate reality and the absolute is a concrete universal, which is precisely the superjectivist perspective in paraphilosophy, as the dialectical integration of both subjectivity and objectivity. The idea that superjectivism represents an absolute truth does seem to conflict with both Madhyamaka and paraphilosophy in their attempt to transcend relative rational perspectives, as superjectivism is ultimately a rational perspective we can have about the world. We might be inclined to make an association here between Hegel's absolute and the Vedantic concept of Brahman, but we must first remember that Brahman can be characterized in two different ways. In its determinate, immanent form, there is indeed a connection to Hegel's ultimate reality, as a kind of unity of subject and object. Just as Hegel's absolute is expressed through the dialectical unfolding of reality, Saguna Brahman manifests through its active roles of creation, preservation, and destruction. The main difference, perhaps, is that Hegel's absolute is rational in its self-realizing process, while Saguna Brahman, though still rational in its cosmic role, is often associated with illusion, maya, or play, lila. However, the indeterminate, transcendent aspect of Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, is beyond reason entirely, and is not an empirical unity of the subject and object, but a transcendent reality that transcends all conceptual frameworks and oppositions. Indeed, the Advaita tradition maintains that this is the only real form of Brahman, which would render Hegel's absolute a relative truth, or an illusion caused by ignorance, though Hegel does acknowledge that ignorance is a necessary element of the process of self-rationalization. So, the similarities between Hegel's absolute and Vedantic thought are more apparent in the less radical interpretations of Vedanta, such as Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita and perhaps also Neo-Vedanta, in which the world and the divine are seen as interdependent and complementary. Hegel wants to arrive at absolute knowing by exploring the dialectical structure of thought, and this is a fundamentally rational process, operating via the synthetic integration of all rational perspectives. Advaita Vedanta and Madhyamaka, by contrast, seek to arrive at absolute knowing not through the synthesis of perspectives, but through the negation of all conceptual distinctions, aiming to negate or transcend dualities such as subject, object, self, other, and existence, non-existence, rather than to synthesize them. So, there is a big question mark here that warrants investigation. Is the absolute knowing of Hegel and the absolute knowing of Madhyamaka ultimately the same thing, even though they are arrived at in what seem to be totally opposite ways? One reason to think that they are the same is that both begin from the recognition that reason is inherently relative and operates through opposites like subject and object, self and other, existence and non-existence. The reason to think they cannot be the same is that Hegel's absolute knowing is the total synthesis of views, while Madhyamaka's is the total negation of views, and the total negation of views cannot itself be a view, while Hegel's synthesis, insofar as it is rational, must be a view. At first glance, the contrast seems straightforward. These are two opposite and irreconcilable approaches. However, I think the relationship is deeper than this, and I'm going to try my best to articulate why. First, ordinary human reason functions by analysing and differentiating opposites, adhering to the principle that contradictions imply falsity. And if Hegel is saying that the absolute truth is the synthesis of all opposites, then we cannot discriminate between opposites. We must transcend discrimination, and so reason must be doing something very different for Hegel than how we usually think about it. For Hegel, contradiction is not a sign of falsehood, but an essential force driving the evolution of truth, as a consequence of its continual sublation and resolution. Could it be, therefore, that the absolute truth, for Hegel, can be described in some sense as non-rational? While it remains structured and intelligible, it does not conform to conventional binary logic. It might be supra-rational and para-consistent, but from the standpoint of ordinary reason, it could simply appear irrational and inconsistent. Is it possible that there is some kind of connection, perhaps even complementarity, between the constructive synthesis of all views and the deconstructive negation of all views? This is certainly what paraphilosophy would have us believe. It's also worth considering for a moment the relation between Hegel and Jainism, another ancient Indian tradition with important similarities, but also important differences to Buddhism. Jainism has this idea of non-one-sidedness, anekantavada, which appears to provide a complementary approach to the Buddhist middle way. Non-one-sidedness emphasizes the complex and multifaceted nature of reality. Every perspective captures a partial truth, but none of them are absolutely true. The difference with Buddhism is that the Jains are quite happy to accept that two opposing views both describe reality, while the Buddhists prefer to refuse to accept either. That is, the Jains see the relativity of truth as reflecting partial aspects of a more complete understanding, while the Buddhists see the relativity of truth as pointing to the emptiness of all views, emphasizing the absence of an ultimate perspective. So, if we are to take the question of whether there is a self, Jainism asserts that yes, there is a self, but also no, there is not a self in the sense typical of Indian philosophy, and this is explained via synthesis, where there is an eternal self with inherent qualities like consciousness and bliss, but this self is constantly changing and transforming. That is to say, the self is both permanent in essence and ever-changing in experience, and thus can be described both as a fundamental substance and as an ongoing process, which is similar to an argument I made previously in suggesting a way to reconcile the Buddhist notion of no-self with the Vedantic notion of self. And this unity of permanence and change is also precisely the kind of thing that Hegel was getting at, and also Heraclitus back in ancient Greece, who proclaimed that the only constant is change. So, Jainism is a kind of pluralism, asserting that multiple valid perspectives exist, each offering partial truths about reality. Madhyamaka, by contrast, is a kind of relativism, claiming that all truths are relative and interdependent, with no fixed ultimate perspective, only a middle way that transcends extremes. And Hegel is an absolutist, who acknowledges the existence of multiple truths or contradictions, but believes these truths ultimately resolve into a unified absolute, which is the total, self-realizing truth that has integrated all partial truths within itself. However, more needs to be said here, because there is great nuance to Hegel's system which is prone to misunderstanding. Remember, the concrete universal is realized through particular ideas and phenomena. It is not an abstract entity, but exists only in its specific historical manifestations. It is therefore conditioned only by its own structure, and not by anything external to itself. The opposites are the incomplete moments of the absolute, and the fact that we can synthesize our way towards the absolute means that the opposites themselves contain truth. The synthesis of opposites is precisely the unfolding of truth. The absolute is therefore the truth of the development of relativity, and all of the moments of development in the revelation of truth are indeed relative, which is a notion shared by both paraphilosophy and Madhyamaka. That is, emptiness is not a noumenon set against phenomena, but is rather the nature of phenomena themselves. But in Madhyamaka, interdependence is ultimately the same as emptiness, as samsara is the same as nirvana. Everything conceivable is relative, and thus the ultimate is beyond conception. Hegel, however, maintains that while everything conceivable is relative, conception itself is reality, and so the absolute truth is in part the absoluteness of relativity, which is to say that relationality and incompleteness is the essence of the absolute, which is also the drive to overcome these things. So, if the rational is real, means that what is rationally conceivable is conventionally or relatively true, then what is not rationally conceivable would seem to be outside the realm of conventional truth. Does this mean that the absolute truth is non-rational in the sense of being beyond finite reasoning? While Hegel's absolute is grounded in rational self-realization, it's possible that the limitations of human reason point to something beyond what we can fully grasp with reason, even though reason is the means by which the absolute realizes itself. For Hegel, the absolute is indeed beyond complete articulation. It transcends our finite relative concepts. So the absolute is non-rational in the sense that it exceeds the boundaries of finite human reasoning. But it is also the inherent rationality of the absolute which allows for our incomplete dialectical perspectives, not to mention the development of reality itself. So rationality is fundamental to the absolute. Indeed, the absolute is reason, is reality. It is the principle that structures the unfolding of reality in accordance with reason, slowly becoming intelligible through the dialectical historical process, which involves the resolution of contradictions and the synthesis of opposites. This is a rational process following a logical structure: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. At each stage, the apparent irrationality of the contradiction, where two ideas are both partially true, is overcome at a higher level, where opposition is revealed as unity. Irrationality is therefore not a denial of reason, but an incomplete form of reason. So, the ineffability of the absolute, which is precisely the ever-changing, self-unfolding activity that generates reality, becomes intelligible not as a static object, but through its actual instances of development, which is the dialectic. Concrete instances of synthesis are little windows into the absolute, and so the absolute is ineffable in the sense that it can only be grasped through its own self-revealing process, through reflecting on history. It may then be the case that the ineffability of the essence of the dialectical process is something that can be grasped non-rationally, perhaps through mystical insight, perhaps through non-dual awareness, while nevertheless still being fundamentally rational, and thus theoretically reachable by rationality, even if only as the very pinnacle of the development of rationality. This would be the convergence of science and spirituality, where reason's own self-recognition of its limits becomes a non-rational form of understanding. In fact, this may well be a necessary conclusion, for if we take paraphilosophy as a non-rational superposition of perspectives, and the dialectical matrix to be the structure of individual perspectives, and if paraphilosophy and philosophy are complementary, then the non-rational and the rational are two aspects of one thing. In a similar way, emptiness, which is non-rational, and dependent origination, which is rational, are two aspects of the same thing. Another thing I feel is significant about the use of dialectic in both Hegel and Madhyamaka is the fact that both systems emphasize the negation of negation. For Madhyamaka, negation refers to the rejection of particular absolutist perspectives and to the relativity of perspectives, signifying emptiness. The negation of negation then refers to the universal application of negation, to the emptiness of emptiness itself, or to the fact that the idea that no perspective is ultimately true is also not ultimately true. Remember, emptiness is not an independent essence, but is always relative to particular perspectives or phenomena. What this means is that, again, emptiness is not to be taken as an independent, transcendent reality, but more importantly, it implies that the fact that we have rejected the absolute truth of any perspective does not mean that nothing is true. And the fact that we have rejected the idea that any phenomenon has inherent existence does not mean that nothing is real. The negation of negation is precisely how Madhyamaka avoids nihilism, because it is precisely the negation of negation, the emptiness of emptiness, which accounts for the interdependent arising of all things. One more time, emptiness is ultimately non-dual with dependent origination. And this, by all accounts, points towards a kind of spontaneous arising of reality, which is a profound idea, and which certainly has a positive and even rational meaning, even if it cannot be completely explained. Now, for Hegel, negation begins with the rejection of a given thesis, such as being, which is contradicted by its opposite, non-being. This contradiction, which is inherent in the concept itself, marks the first negation. It is this contradiction that is now negated again, or rather sublated, transforming the contradiction into a new higher unity, or synthesis, namely becoming. So Hegel's process actually is purely negative, because it's never taking a position and affirming it as the whole truth. But this kind of absolute negativity is not purely destructive, because Hegel finds within this continual negativity a kind of positivity. The deconstructive process becomes constructive by negating its own negativity. Negation is not rejection, but movement towards completeness. This idea of the productivity of absolute negativity sounds to me not too dissimilar to the Madhyamaka idea of emptiness as the groundless ground of phenomena. We could perhaps attempt to present the Madhyamaka position through Hegel's dialectical method. First, we would have the thesis that things have independent existence. Then we get the antithesis that things do not have independent existence. And finally, we get the anti-antithesis that things neither have, nor do they not have, independent existence, which corresponds to the insight of interdependent existence, where phenomena arise dependently on each other. This really isn't all too different from Hegel's synthesis of being and non-being into becoming. Both point towards a kind of absolute relativity. For Madhyamaka, the fact that nothing exists on its own means that everything is relative to other things. For Hegel, the fact that things are always becoming via the negation of what they could be also means that all things are relative. And to go back to something I suggested in a previous video, if everything is interdependent, then the world of interdependence is not dependent on a thing called emptiness. It is, in a real way, not dependent. And so we get the paradoxical conclusion that interdependent existence is non-dependent, and that the nature of non-dependence is interdependence. The only meaningful notion of independence is found in the autonomy of the network of relationships, where every phenomenon depends on others for its existence. This, again, reflects a unity of opposites reminiscent of Heraclitus's assertion that the only constant is change, or Hegel's idea of unity amid diversity, or the idea that the nature of substance is process, or perhaps even that the absolute is the absence of itself, the relativity of all things. However, this still does not directly explain the divergence between the Madhyamaka description of the negation of negation as emptiness and the Hegelian description of the same as absolute spirit. But what if we were to take a more Yogacara perspective and assert that emptiness is not merely an absence, but a suchness whose nature is consciousness? Well, then phenomena would be interdependent with consciousness, which is a lot closer to the Hegelian idea. It's also important to recognize that, for Hegel, self-consciousness is a necessary stage in the self-realization of absolute spirit and absolute freedom, but it is not the final realization. Self-consciousness arises through mutual recognition. Each individual's sense of self is interdependent with the recognition of other self-conscious individuals. There is, therefore, no self-consciousness without involvement with the world, and this characterization of selfhood as an interdependent process resonates with the Buddhist denial of an inherently existing self-entity. Furthermore, as we know, Hegel's spirit is realized through the dialectical synthesis of opposites, and so, according to his method, the rational realization or recognition of emptiness would require integration with the contrary notion of fullness. Perhaps he would argue that the Buddhist sunyata must be integrated with the Vedic Brahman, and perhaps this fact underlies some of the later development in Mahayana Buddhism, where emptiness takes on the characterization of luminous awareness. In fact, Hegel himself states that being, pure being, without any further determination, is pure indeterminateness and emptiness. Pure being and pure nothing are, therefore, the same. Both lack specific determination, and their synthesis produces becoming. We also find this idea of unity through opposition spelled out in several Gnostic sources, including Nicholas of Cusa and Carl Jung. Ultimately, Hegel's spirit is a process of becoming, so it involves and transcends both being and non-being, similarly to Yogacara. To quote Asanga here, "The non-existence of duality is indeed the existence of non-existence. This is the definition of emptiness. It is neither existence nor non-existence, neither different nor identical." Here, Asanga expresses that emptiness is not simply the absence of things, but the absence of inherent dualities, much like how Hegel's dialectic moves beyond rigid oppositions by integrating and transcending them. The final problem we need to discuss, and perhaps the only real one for Hegel, is whether the dialectical process of sublation or synthesis ever actually does reach this absolute state of all-encompassing knowledge, or whether it remains an ongoing ascent to ever more comprehensive, yet still relative levels of understanding. If Hegel's dialectic cannot convincingly demonstrate a finally complete self-knowing concept, one might instead argue, a la some strands of Advaita or Mahayana Buddhism, that ultimate knowledge is not discursive, but a direct, non-dual awareness. But I don't think this is counter to what Hegel is actually saying. Sure, Hegel's absolute represents the final synthesis of the dialectical process, where all contradictions are resolved into unity. This does indeed imply a kind of final endpoint, where the concept now comprehends itself as the whole, but that very comprehension is the recognition that reality is ceaseless self-reflection. The absolute is itself the process of the dialectic, the essence of change and becoming, and so it is in fact always evolving. It is the principle by which evolution occurs. Again, the absolute is a concrete universal, meaning it is not separate from the relative and particular, and so the absolute is necessarily already present in the process of self-realization, because it is that process. It is not simply the static goal of the dialectic, but the dialectic itself. So the absolute is manifesting through the world as its activity, and the appearance of relativity and fragmentation and separation are the very forces that drive dialectical consciousness to continually overcome its own incompleteness and contradictory divisions. So there is a kind of paradox that exists in Hegel's system. The dialectic is both the force that drives life and evolution forward, and the dialectic is that which life is driven to overcome. That is, the absolute is both that which evolution is attracted towards, and it is that which is driving evolution forward. Even though the actual dialectical process of development is purely rational, its own self-realization is self-defeating, and so it is driven by what is, in at least one sense, delusion, the notion that certain ideas could represent absolute truths. It is this delusion, or incompleteness, which motivates the ongoing process of improvement. This is not too dissimilar to the belief that an individual can gain enlightenment, or that enlightenment is something different than what is already present. To have actually achieved absolute self-knowledge, and thus reached the end of the dialectical process, simply means that we have stepped outside of this loop of believing we have ever actually reached absolute self-knowledge, or reached the end of the dialectical process. It means that we have seen that the process itself was already the absolute, and this cannot be a discursively rational thing, though, for Hegel, it is the highest form of speculative rationality. Consciousness must recognize that what once appeared as a restless quest is already the actuality of the whole, for the process and the absolute are one and the same. That consciousness is continually seeking the absolute is the absolute itself, and when it realizes this, it realizes that the ultimate truth was never separate from our own incompleteness and striving. At a very basic level, then, the dialectic is the drive to overcome itself, the drive to transcend its own attraction towards transcendence, and this cannot be fully achieved through ordinary rationality. This is not a neurotic compulsion, but the very life of the concept. Wisdom depends on ignorance, because we can only be wise of something if we can also be ignorant of it. In a similar way, ultimate truth depends on relative truth, as relative truth is necessary for the realization of ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is therefore the relativity of all truths, which is tantamount to saying that the only fixed ultimate truth is that there is no fixed ultimate truth. The absolute concept itself is the process of trying to grasp the concept. As such, I think it's not too unreasonable to suggest that the absolute concept of Hegel is not a million miles away from the emptiness of Buddhism. The final realization of reason is to realize that there was never anything to realize other than its own ability to realize, which is pure freedom. And that's it. We've now only got one more video to go in this particular series, and that's to consider Schopenhauer. But that's not the end. We're still only scraping the surface, really, and I wanted to spend a little more time getting into this whole spirituality thing before we move back to academia and talk about people like Husserl and Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, and maybe eventually things like post-structuralism too. Thank you, as always, for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again.